Oh, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Connolly, and I am a Superior Court judge in the County of Santa Cruz. And the first thing I wanted to do is thank our sponsors. The League of Women Voters and Santa Cruz County Women Lawyers are co-sponsoring this event. It qualifies for MCLE credits, and I'm just so happy to be here. I was commenting to Barbara when I came in that it was almost 10 years ago, maybe a little short, maybe it was in 2010. I became a judge in 2010. I was elected to serve in June. And it was really a transformational experience. And as part of that experience, I got to meet Barbara. I got to address this group, not in the context of running for election, but prior to that time, in the context of talking about important issues that impacted, I believe that my talk to the League of Women Voters had to do with constitutional rights, because one of the things that I did do when I was an attorney was practice in federal court. And so I had experience representing people, both the city of Watsonville with respect to excessive force cases, and then I also had the experience of representing political parties engaged in issues concerning free speech. So I wanted to give you a little background about myself, but as one of the topics that I did, in fact, want to specifically address is some transformations that occurred while I was the presiding judge of juvenile court, serving as the dependency judge in Watsonville. And since I know not everybody here is an attorney, I'd like to give some context. And so there are handouts in the back. It's a 2-page handout that talks about the Continuum of Care Reform. So first of all, I'll give some context about our Superior Court. We have 2 courthouses. We have one in Santa Cruz County, and that is where we do our jury trials. Currently, I sit in Department 4. And so I'm hoping some of you are on a jury panel next week, because I am going to need you. I'm going to be doing a criminal jury trial. And so I'll be interacting with citizens from our community and selecting a jury, an incredibly important process. We have 3 exclusively felony courts. We have my court, which is a hybrid court. I am doing domestic violence cases right now, misdemeanor and felony domestic violence cases, as well as an early resolution court for driving under the influence cases. So our thought in organizing the courthouse that way is that we're able to get some cases that people are offered a different type of early resolution offer so that we can get their case expeditiously done. And if they are able to resolve their case at the first appearance, then they're able to get less jail time, fewer fines, etc. The other 2 courthouses in Santa Cruz criminal courts are our misdemeanor courts. And then we have 2 civil courts. So that's in Santa Cruz County. And I know I want to say it's been about 12 years. 12 years. We have just an amazing facility in Watsonville. And what we do with our courts in Watsonville, there's 4 courthouses. And then we have a wing that is our family court services wing. And then we also have a self-help center. We have self-help centers both in Watsonville, which is an amazing center, and I can explain a little bit about that, as well as our library in Santa Cruz. So just in terms of access to justice, now the fact that in Santa Cruz we have these centers where, a lot of times people can't afford an attorney. They're worried about issues that they're having disputes with their neighbors. They have a small claims court issue, which small claims court, I was the presiding judge of small claims court when I was in Watsonville as well. So our self-help centers are really about access to justice, making it so that you can work on a guardianship, you can work on a conservatorship, you can work on representing yourself in a family law matter. For example, if you have a child and you're not married and you don't have family law custody or visitation orders, if you go to the self-help center, you can file those papers improper, and the self-help center will give you the forms and help you just essentially be able to do things that make life so much easier for everyday people, and they're able to represent themselves because they have the assistance through our self-help center. But the other amazing thing about how we've designed our court in Watsonville, and I feel like this really is serving the public interest, is that it's our family courts. So Department A is the dependency court. And so on Thursday afternoons, it's the small claims court. And on Fridays, it does adoptions, which are just amazing thing. I was telling Pam just about the fact that these are just amazing ceremonies that you do. Private adoptions, they'll help you in the self-help center. I do adult adoptions, or I did adult adoptions. But these adoptions are just amazing ceremonies where I'm able to come off the bench just like I am here with you and just really interact with people and just celebrate the fact that they're making this commitment to a child or another person, and they're just really fun ceremonies that kind of help alleviate all the very intense deep work that you do as a dependency judge. So we have Department A, and I'll come back around and explain a little bit about dependency because it's a confidential courtroom, right? And not many people know what goes on inside it. Department B is our juvenile justice court. There's been a transformation. We changed the name from juvenile delinquency because it's just really a pejorative term and really not about what's going on here in Santa Cruz County. So now it's called juvenile justice. And Judge Guy, who is currently sitting as the presiding judge of the juvenile court, is sitting in that department. Judge Simons is sitting in the dependency department, and as I said, I just moved as of July 22nd after serving 4 years in Department A. I'm now up in Santa Cruz. We have two family courts, and indeed, Judge Marigonda and Judge Basket are family law judges. And so why we have it set up that way is there's so many interactions, and we also do domestic violence restraining orders in Watsonville because we have this self-help center there. And then in addition, because a lot of times the issues that kind of spark some of the domestic violence have so many underlying issues with custody and visitation. So what we have is we have our family court services. We have the judge is able to make referrals, and at no cost. If you miss your appointment, there's a cost, but you have access to, I believe it's 3 hours of mediation through family court services once a year. And so what happens is we have licensed marriage and family therapists who are there, who are able to work with the parties because, as we know, if you're able to mediate and come to an agreement as to how you want to share custody and visitation, a lot of times it's something that you're much more willing to follow along with. So that is a broad aspect of how our Santa Cruz court system is set up. We also now are doing traffic. We have a new traffic commissioner, Emily Trexel. And I didn't mention who the judges in Santa Cruz are. Our presiding judge is Paul Burdick, and Judge Burdick is the judge who has just been elected by all the judges to serve for the next year to make decisions as to assignments and other administrative issues in our court. Tim Volkman is the assistant presiding judge. Saida Cogliati was just elected last year. Tim Schmall was recently appointed, and they're both in our misdemeanor departments. John Gallagher ran at the same time as I did, and he is the other sitting civil judge. And then we have Judge Salazar in Department 7 and Judge Siegel in Department 6. So they're both sitting in a felony assignment, and Judge Burdick is in a civil assignment, and Judge Volkman and Judge Burdick will be switching assignments. So that's, I'm sure, much more information about our court system than you wanted, but I did want to give you some context. As I said, our family dependency court is a confidential court, so not many people know what is happening in that court. I know I certainly didn't when I started in July of 2015. And it is a court where the Department of Family and Children's Services files a petition naming a child, all right, because that child has been abused or neglected as defined under the California Welfare and Institutions Code. All right, and we use similar language. It's all under the Welfare and Institutions Code because it's all about the protection of children. And you use that same code section, but in a slightly different manner in juvenile justice, because a lot of times most of the time the focus in juvenile justice is making sure that the child complies or the youth complies with the case plan. And in dependency, it's all about the parents complying with the case plan so that they can be a safe parent. So the Continuum of Care Reform that we have the handout about, what happened is actually it was an initiative that was championed by Mark Stone, and what you'll hear about it as is it was really a concern that the long-term permanent plan for too many youth who had been removed from their family became long-term foster care, right? And so the Continuum of Care Reform was to make sure that we were more focused on the child-centric. What was in the child's best interest? Family finding, family connection, making sure that the department was paying attention to focusing on doing everything they could to find those connections with family members, so that instead of being in a group home, these children could be in a more family-like setting, because we know children and youth thrive in family-like settings. And so it's really a mandate to close group homes. And so, but what do we do? Because I'll tell you, sitting there, a lot of times there are some youth who are just struggling with emotional issues, some very serious mental health issues. And so what was done to replace those is short-term residential treatment programs, and they're supposed to be limited to a 6-month period where you could get intensive services to help surround and wrap around that youth to make it so that they could succeed, to then step down to hopefully a resource family placement. So you probably heard about foster families and foster placements. Really, the language has now changed to resource family placements. And so the idea too was to try to speed up placement and placement for permanent homes for youth, part of the system. And so the resource family application in the beginning of a case would also serve as the application if that family ended up wanting to adopt that child. All right, so that was another change that happened. And so interestingly, part of the job of the juvenile judge is to make a determination. On the first blush, when when the Department of Family and Children and Services goes and removes a child from a family due to safety concerns, it's that judge's responsibility to make sure that that department has taken made reasonable efforts to make sure that there isn't some type of alternative that the department could have used to make that child safe. For example, sexual abuse, right? If there was an allegation of sexual abuse, one way that you could make sure that the family is safe is if it was a boyfriend or, a family member. You could make sure that that family member was removed from the home, right? And then you could say, hey, if we put a safety plan in place where that parent signs and says, I agree not to let that person have any contact with my child, you can see how the child could be safe and you don't need to remove them, right? And so if that hadn't been explored prior to the removal, it would be the job of the juvenile court judge to ask those questions, to make sure that type of effort, that every effort had been made. There's no reasonable means by which that child could safely remain in the home without removal. And I know that when I was preparing my talk today, one of the things that I was told is that in December of 2017, our juvenile probation came in and gave a talk to you, Fernando Geraldo, about what an amazing job our probation department does. And so another part of my talk is to talk about, I worked as the presiding judge of juvenile court. I worked with our juvenile probation because I would be the backup judge for Judge Guy or Judge Morse. Heather Morse, who you may have known, she was the first woman judge appointed in Santa Cruz County. And I just want to give you some context too. 1989, as a municipal court judge. And I'll come back to my topic because there's, municipal court judges and superior court judges are seen as different at that point in time. That was abolished in 1995. And so the courts were united, and there was no distinction any longer between municipal court judge. I could be wrong about that date. I think it's 1998. I'm looking to my legal team over here. I think it was 1998 that the unification happened, so that all judges became superior court judges. And so that's why we have, in Santa Cruz County, we have this unique thing. The first superior court judge was Kathleen Cow in 1994. And so that's why we have if you're a historian, as my dear friend Sarah Clarenbach here in court is, if you have, there's the Santa Cruz County Legal History, which goes into great detail, a book that she, as well as some other legal notables here in Santa Cruz County, put together a legal history of Santa Cruz County talk about. So we have two first women judges in Santa Cruz County. It's kind of interesting. Municipal court, Heather Morse, and then when the courts became one, Judge Morse, Heather Morse became a superior court judge. And so we had two women superior court judges. And I believe I'm correct, there's 12 judicial officers, one converted from a commissioner. And so for quite some period of time, we only had two women, and I just to give you some context about how different that is. I graduated law school in 1989, and so it took until 1989 when I graduated for Santa Cruz to have a woman judge. And so part of the talk today, too, is to give that context as to why I became a judge and what motivated me to become a judge. And so that's why I'm just giving you some context with respect to that. And then the next judge we had, Kathleen Cow, died I believe it was in 2005, and she was just an amazing judge, worked at county council, and she was one of our dependency judges. She just did an amazing thing about making sure our dependency system was trauma informed, and they didn't use those words back then, but Judge Acow, I never saw her because it was a confidential courtroom. I didn't ever get to see her in action, but I've seen pictures of her. I knew who she was, and I just know that she brought that very powerful trauma-informed lens to judging, and I really wish I had gotten to see her do that, because she was just an amazing jurist and quite a loss. Judge Guy was appointed in her place, so we had 2 women judges. And then the third woman judge, it was Ari Simon. She was elected in 2008 after an election, and that election was a hotly contested election, and she won in June of 2008, the same year that Barack Obama was elected, right? Just pretty different times. And then it's just so great that Sarah Clarenbach's here, because, the whole reason that I'm a judge here in Santa Cruz County has very much to do with Sarah Clarenbach. Sarah came to me and asked me if I would be interested in running a campaign. At that time, I was the only woman in the race. Eventually 2 seats opened up, but it was, as I said when I first started talking, transformational. And I just want to acknowledge the huge role that having women mentors like Sarah Clarenbach in your life makes for you. My daughter's father's family is from Santa Cruz County, and the DeLotte family. And so I was very lucky. I feel part of Santa Cruz since I was 21 years old, or I guess it was 20 years old. So one of the things that her father and we always wanted to live in Santa Cruz County, right? And it just takes so much work to find a job here. And so he was getting his PhD at UC Berkeley in entomology. He did sustainable agriculture, really working on finding alternatives to pesticides in agriculture. And I was in law school at UC Davis. I'll be attending my 30th year reunion this year, and I can't wait to see my old friends. So the first job I had out of law school was as a federal clerk. A law clerk, they call them law clerk positions for a federal judge. I didn't really have a legal a background of attorneys in my family, so I didn't really have, mentors to talk to. But I just remember this one amazing law school professor who said, Rebecca, you're the top of your class. You should really, in the top of your class, you should really apply for a clerkship. And I said, okay, here, you apply across the state. And I applied for a clerkship and got a clerkship with Judge Ray in Los Angeles County. And since I have such a lovely long time to talk here today and all these things, that one of the other connections I want to make is athletics. Because why did he hire me? He was a Reagan appointee. He was a lovely man, just really, really lovely. And here I am. I had just some long hair, and I was very interested in environmental law. and social justice. And so why did he hire me? Well, he loved sports, right? And so I am one of those first generations that got the benefit of Title IX. I played volleyball for UC Berkeley, Cal. I was a scholarship athlete there. We were 9th in the nation twice. We got to play in the Sweet 16s. We were just amazing volleyball team. And our volleyball team, what was another very cool thing about our volleyball team is we always had the highest GPA at Cal. They kept records of that. And I just had a reunion with them this summer where we were celebrating one of the players who I played with, her 60th birthday. So we still get together in Berkeley, and I bring them out here. But what's so significant about that is, right, that's how I got my job. He loved the fact. In fact, it was kind of difficult. He was like really interested in my height. You know, it was like, hey, you know, you bring people, come in and meet my law clerk. Look at her, she played volleyball. And you know, I mean, what a wonderful thing. But I just want to, again, give some context. So here I am, Division I athlete playing for one of the best teams in the nation in volleyball. Did we have a locker room? No. No, we didn't. So I did get a scholarship. I wasn't recruited, even though, you know, I was like one of the best athletes in San Diego County. I went up and tried out at Berkeley. You know, I said, hey, I should play on your team, you know, and I had to do that. So, you know, just, I mean, another great skill in terms of promoting yourself. But for Title IX, 1973, but for Title IX, you know, where would I have been? Just because Cal's first team, 1976. So I graduated high school in 1981. So it's still pretty new. And we would change in the women's bathroom before games. We got to use the same Harmon gym that the men's basketball, and we got to play at Harmon Gym. But now, let me tell you, they have the most beautiful locker room. It's really wonderful to see that level of equality that's happened. But I have to say, I do credit the fact that I was one of the beneficiaries of Title IX, because that's how I got this incredibly prestigious job down in Los Angeles. Ronald Reagan was deposed in that building over the Iran-Contra in the basement there. I got to work on some really fascinating environmental cases. One of the landmark case involving Montrose Chemical. I worked with the judge on writing an opinion on the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and then the kind of cool one, which has a fun name, was the New Kids on the Block, where it just dates me so much about how the use of an 800 number, whether or not, you know, people were making money by off the new kids by having them dial in on the 800 number. And so, of course, the new kids weren't happy about their likeness being used to make money for someone else, right? And so I worked with the judge on that. After I did my clerkship, I joined my daughter, Chloe's father, in Reedley, and I represented migrant farm workers for the next 2.5 years. And what an amazing experience. I speak Spanish, and just representing migrant farm workers, being out in the field with them, making sure that these farm workers were getting their basic human rights met. I had clients who had paychecks for $0. And you know, in some ways, you were doing the work of basically protecting public safety, even though it was out there. And it was, I have to say, some pretty, when you're representing migrant farm workers and doing legal services work in the Central Valley, it's a very politically contentious work to do, but it was some incredibly honorable work. It gave me insight to just how hard those who are laboring in the fields to make sure that we have our food work, and how just making sure that basic labor code regulations are met, that they get paid, that they get water, that they get bathrooms, all those basic things we were working to make sure happened. And so that was wonderful work that I got to do, and I got to do that work. We were the Migrant Farm Worker Project, and so we were allowed to do impact litigation. And so we were filing class action cases. And in fact, when I came from Los Angeles, I got immediately to start on a federal lawsuit that was the law firm was engaged in. I got to sit third chair, but I got to give insight from coming right from that federal court position to doing this just incredibly interesting litigation, and part of it in front of a very cranky federal judge, I have to say. But after that, we really wanted to come to Santa Cruz County because it's just one of the most beautiful places to live. And because I spoke Spanish, and because some of the Santa Cruz County District Attorney's Office was looking for individuals who spoke Spanish, I was able to come and temporarily work here. And why this follows back to Sarah is Sarah knew the DeLotte family. And so Sarah, I was able to connect with as one of the first people I met in Santa Cruz County in my profession. And she gave me guidance, gave me input, and she also, as a fellow legal services attorney, she just gave me all kinds of insight into, hey, the first thing you should do, Rebecca, is join the Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. Because Sarah, in fact, was one of the founding members, or the founder of the Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. And eventually, I'm here, Moira Lay's here, and Susan Tomley, both who have been presidents of the Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. Yeah, and I am, in 2009, I still have my beautiful framed poster. I was the president of the Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. And so I think when you look at the how important women mentorship is, so Saida Cogliati, I asked her to join the board. She was president of Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. She is now a judge. And Emily Trexel, she is one of our commissioners and a past president of the Women Lawyers of Santa Cruz County. So when you think about that impact and how important it is to have mentors, I just, that's just incredibly important. And you feel impact and reach, and how, wow, one person can make such a difference in a career trajectory for people. Mentorships are incredibly important, and I'm just really thankful that I had that connection and ability to take advantage of everything that Santa Cruz County had to offer, because Santa Cruz County still only had those 2 women judges when I was here most of my time. 2008, Judge Simons became the 3rd, and actually the 4th, because we lost Judge Acau. And then I was elected in 2010, and now we have Judge Cogliati and Judge Baskett, who was appointed to the Superior Court. And so, so now, I'll bring this back around to our dependency court, and just some of the things that we do there. So you had the talk in 2017 about the fact that here in Santa Cruz County, our probation department is part of the Casey Foundation is a big funder of the work that our juvenile probation department does in exploring alternatives to detention. And I know that across the country, people are really rethinking about, should we be locking up youth? When, what's going on? If there's and the disparity in what youth are getting locked up, right? There's just a huge disparity in the number of brown and black young men who are placed in detention when you look at the populations as a whole. And the impact that, a lot of times these young men, you have to balance public safety versus the well-being of these youth, right? And so as being a champion and a model across the nation and actually internationally as well, because recently I was just giving presentations with our juvenile probation department to judges in Mexico, which was wonderful. And just trying to show people how family engagement, youth and family engagement, giving youth, finding out what are the core root problems versus what's really happening. What are these crimes? Are these crimes against their family members because there's mental health issues? So a lot of times you'll have youth who are in juvenile detention facilities that are struggling with mental health issues, self-medicating with drugs, and acting out in ways at home. And then the parents have to call police because their safety is threatened, and then youth get detained. Well, just as I was talking about in our family and children's services, what they have to engage in, this part of their work is to make sure that they've wrapped a family with services, offered a family services before you remove them. You have to do the same thing in juvenile delinquency in our juvenile justice system. You have to make sure that you've offered that family services, that there's no reasonable means by which that child can be safely maintained in the home without removal. It's the same finding that you have to make in juvenile dependency as in our juvenile justice system. And now you all have advanced degrees in juvenile law. Not many people understand that connection, that it's the same thing. And so at a few talks I've been at, because probation's so wonderful about going out and talking about how they're a model program for developing alternatives to detention. So for example, one of the things is we have the evening center in Watsonville. Amazing place where a lot of times you have these youth that if their parents are working all day and night trying to support themselves, they don't have a safe place to go except with other individuals. And you can see how both young males are preyed upon, and young females are preyed upon too by people who don't have their best interests at heart, right? And if they don't have a safe place to go to engage in pro-social activities, that it's much harder for our youth to flourish, be able to go to school, to be able to thrive, to be able to have a normal adult or young adult existence. And so so the evening center, it's wonderful. It actually serves not only as a way that probation can kind of help youth, steer them in the right direction. They have, I've just seen the youth talk about the mentors who are there, who they help with homework. They help problem solve. If they need a job, they help kind of figure out things around that. If they're struggling with substance abuse, if they're having difficulty around relationship issues, the evening center has therapists, counselors there. You know, it's just a wonderful place right in the heart of Watsonville that provides this alternative to detention. So a judge, instead of saying, yeah, you need to stay in juvenile hall, can say, look, you need to attend the evening center, 3 days a week. And get them engaged in other pro-social activities. Last night I was at a fundraiser for the Aztecas, and kind of connecting that sports thing. I know how important sports were in my life. So Gina Castaneda, we're one of the leads, is a probation officer who helps these youth succeed through soccer. Not only do they get to play soccer, but then they get to mentor and do summer camps, and then they just get to engage and become part and belong, because we know how expensive all those clubs and camps are, right? And so she is actually taking 3 young men down to try out for the Olympic team. I mean, is that just so amazing? And so that's another part of what our probation, juvenile probation, is really funding and mentoring. Is like, great, when a youth comes in, they have an opportunity to do their community service. They have an opportunity to satisfy a lot of other things that would be like, yeah, spend some time in juvenile hall, right? No, we want this youth developing skills so that they can become independent, right? That they can feel that self-confidence that you get from participating in sports or athletics. Our Santa Cruz Probation Department, I have to say, it's famous, not only here in Santa Cruz County, but just so we really do have these programs. And a new program that our probation office has been developing, and I don't know if you talked about it, I'm sure you did, is we have these wraparound programs like Fuerte, and understanding that there's some youth who just have some mental health issues that aren't getting the mental health assistance that they need. And so a lot of times what would happen is, if you have a working family, the counselors only work 8 to 5. If you're working in the fields 7 to 6 during the season, how do you get to that mental health appointment? You miss a whole day of work, then you can't pay your rent. It's just, you can see the ripple effects for a family. And so through probation, in working with other nonprofits, they're able to actually go out to the family's home and provide some of that counseling and therapy service in the home and really wrap that family around. Another thing, these kids can't get to do their community service because, walking through their neighborhood might not be safe. There might be issues concerning, gang involvement, safety. If they're walking in a street, that their safety's at risk. Our probation department actually goes out and picks up our youth through working with nonprofits, and the Community Action Board in Watsonville is another, as well as Encompass of Santa Cruz, groups that our probation department works to provide these nonprofit services so that we can go out, pick up the youth, bring them, get them engaged in some work, and they're fulfilling their community service hours, because that's usually when a youth is on probation, what the juvenile judge orders is that they engage in 25 or 50 hours of community service. That's the one of the penalties, in addition to any custody time. But again, we're trying to find alternatives to custody, and that evening center also provides this other alternative. I mean, spending a night in custody, that's traumatic. That is just a traumatic experience. And so a lot of times what happens in Watsonville is the Watsonville PD is able to actually book and get the information of a youth at the evening center. And so they don't have to take them all the way down to Felton. And so what we do to make sure that there's access to justice is you can imagine if you're a family that lives in Watsonville and has transportation issues, making it up to juvenile hall up in Felton, that's a big task. And so you can see how alternatives to detention in this community, and we all suffer with the traffic, makes a big difference to families. And so I just have to congratulate our probation team for working so hard to make these alternatives available for families. The other thing they've made available is using electronic monitoring. That's what's happening in the criminal courts, but it's been happening for a long time in juvenile justice, that we're able to keep the community safe by using electronic monitoring services. And part of that recognition, one of the themes that I wanted to come back is that trauma-informed, making sure that we're taking a trauma-informed approach. And so our probation department, I went and I talked with Valerie Thompson. Just, am I getting too close? Is that feedback? I'm just hearing some feedback. About youth and family engagement. And so how important it is that as a judicial officer, we are engaged and seeking to engage the youth and family. And the same holds true in our juvenile dependency court. It's slightly different because we have criminal charges, and so there's a little more the district attorney's office and the public defenders, there's a little more contention in juvenile justice, but we're really trying to work in a collaborative way to make sure that the youth's best interests are met while public safety is served. The same holds true in our juvenile dependency court, except we have county counsel, we have minors counsel, and we have parents counsel. Parents don't have counsel in juvenile justice. And it makes such a difference. Everyone's entitled to counsel in juvenile dependency, and having minors counsel is really wonderful. Of course, the minors have counsel in juvenile justice. But again, the point is understanding that if your children are removed from you as a parent, what an incredibly traumatic event. And sometimes, again, it's your child's running away. You may not know as a parent, you may be struggling. You're completely traumatized by what's going on in your family's life. And so that first courtroom experience, judicial officers have that opportunity to try to engage with family, to try to recognize, acknowledge the trauma that happens. And I've been talking for about 45 minutes, so I just wanted to kind of close with this piece about, I think Continuum of Care Reform is all about being much more child-centric, recognizing the fact that children who are part of our dependency system are suffering all kinds of trauma that has long-term impacts on their overall health. All the evidence shows that. And so by being much more child-centric, the reports have changed, that there's so much more information about the child and what their needs are now in the social workers' reports, because needing to acknowledge and recognize that we need to address the underlying, some of the underlying issues and acknowledge what's happening. And so as a judge coming in, one of the things I've I have really evolved as a judge and feel so thankful that I got to serve as a juvenile judge. It's changed how I judge. And just thinking about back to Judge Acow, it's because it's allowed me to be a judge that actually acknowledges trauma, that when people come into court, I'm not, my job is to engage them, try to help them engage in services, to acknowledge that this could be the worst day of their lives. And I feel like it's really made the experience of people who are in front of me, I've brought the fact that of who I am, right? Of why it's so important that we have people from different backgrounds who have served as legal services attorneys, who have, been college athletes, who have, been engaged in their community, been part of the women lawyers, understand the complexity of life in general. So I feel like somebody who, knows how hard it is to get a job, right? Knows how hard it is to form a business and make a living. Because when you hear the expectations, like I have people I've had bailiffs tell me, hey judge, this parent's gonna come in and we wanna hear the lecture. You tell them, that they shouldn't be doing this, that, and the other thing, and or judge, this parent, they're struggling, they haven't been going to their appointments, you need to give them the lecture, you need to really scare them now. But we know through parenting, right, we know that doesn't work, and that's not who I am, right? I mean, and so it's really kind of let me just say, oh, I don't have to be that. I don't have to be the punishing judge. I don't have to do that. I mean, it's punishment to have your children removed from you. I can encourage and motivate people to change in ways that make sense to me based upon my experience and what helps youth engage. I can listen to people. I can take that time. I can be a different judge. I don't have to be a judge in the mold that I saw, developing as a young attorney. So it really matters. It really makes a difference to have judges who have a variety of life experiences come forward. And I have to say that, being that young woman 10 years ago who was in front of you all, and now being an experienced judge, I've grown, I've learned so much. It's such a pleasure to get to come back and see you 10 years later and get to just celebrate the fact that through all the hard work that you've done, that every day we can make a difference, we can make our community safer, we can become that strong, cohesive community together if we all are, have that same goal. That I love Santa Cruz County. I love our community. We want to work every day to make sure that people in our community have access to justice and that our community is safe. And so I'm excited to be here. It's been great getting to explain to you some of what I've done, and hopefully you have some questions, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have now. Thank you. Yes?
Well, as a layperson, I need some clarification on the terminology.
Sure.
You mentioned minor counsel in one context, but in not another. Does that mean legal representation when you say that?
It does, exactly. Okay. So we call, because even though in both courts, dependency is in the child's name, right? It's the petition is in the name of the child, just like it is in the petition in juvenile justice. This is the name of the youth, because usually they're older. It could be a baby and often is a child, a newborn child who is just born exposed to drugs in their system. And so it could be In re baby boy Smith, right? So that child, even though they can't communicate, is appointed counsel in dependency court. And so the public defender, and in some communities it's so small that you have the public defenders representing both children in both departments, or they would represent usually the parents, the public defender's office. But the public defender's office in our county represents the youth, and they're also minors counsel. But it is interesting how they're officially called minors counsel. And I was going to say, I don't use that terminology in our juvenile justice court because it just comes from that criminal context, but I don't know why not, because they're both minors counsel. They really are both minors counsel. Yeah. Yes?
My understanding from your presentation is that group homes are being phased out. What's happening right now? Where on the spectrum is it right now? Is it at the beginning, or what's happening there?
All right, and so the question, I'm not sure if the question is about where are we in group homes, and we talked, there is this handout and talks about in 2017, all group homes were supposed to be phased out. There's a backlog. And where we are is that, so for the licensing, short-term residential treatment programs, you have to be licensed. So we have homes here like Haven of Hope. We just have some really, which is a wonderful placement opportunity for only girls. And then they actually have placements for 18 to 21-year-olds, which I didn't get to talk about, non-minor dependents, which I'd love to kind of talk about a little. But there is a licensing issue. So statewide, there's still exemptions being offered, and so some youth are not in resource homes, and that this Continuum of Care Reform applies to both systems. And that's why really you're getting this advanced degree in juvenile justice and dependency, because the short-term residential treatment facilities are also placements for youth in our juvenile justice system. And right when I came in to start in 2015, it had passed in, I think, about 2012. But it used to be that after you were 18, if you were a ward, you were there was no more help. You were out, and you know how independent all your children were at 18. So just imagine the level of homelessness for foster youth. And also imagine there's so many crossover youth that have their feet in both systems. And so if there's certain requirements, certain eligibility requirements, but if you were a dependent when you turned 18, or you're a ward in out-of-home placement, then you're entitled to these non-minor dependent benefits until you're 21. You have to meet 5 criteria. You have to be going to school full-time, or working at least 80 hours a month, or participating in a program to help remove barriers to employment. And I don't know why I'm forgetting, or have a medical condition that prevents you. So some youth who say we're suffering from schizophrenia and had a medical diagnosis and couldn't participate. But we just have a really thriving non-minor dependent program, and that Minors Council brought up this really wonderful idea that in dependency court, when you turned 18, why not judge come down off the bench and meet the youth at the council table and have a collaborative discussion. And I tell you, it was just such a wonderful thing to actually work with the youth on talking about what their goals were, and just seeing in 4 years. So I was really lucky, 4 years as a juvenile judge, I got to see some kids make it from 18 to 21 and get to hug them and have just these amazing ceremonies to congratulate them on their success. And so I think that's just been, an incredible, what a wonderful idea. How did it take us so long to figure out? And then also part of this continuum of care reform is that the department in both sides, remember, so the continuum of care reform applies to both systems, and it requires that you have these child family team meetings. So actually now the youth is involved, and there you just have to get really involved in so the focus is not a group home, not a lockup facility, but actually you're looking for resource homes, even for these youth that are engaged in violations of criminal law. So you can imagine sometimes if you could find a family member that could kind of engage them in school away from some of the people who want to take advantage of them. It's hard to break free of some of that stuff. And so you're supposed to engage in family finding, like, wait, if we can't keep them safe here because they're engaged in criminal behavior here, can they be placed with a family member outside of home? And so unfortunately there are still group homes, and you can see how group homes for young girls have been incredibly frightening, a source of one of the other things that is like a revolution, right, in the law that they didn't think about is instead of classifying young girls who were being exploited, not sexually exploited, commercially sexually exploited, instead of seeing them as the perpetrators, arresting them, placing them in juvenile hall, right? That they're actually being exploited and they're the victims. And so that, fortunately, you're thinking, wow, how did it take so long to realize that, when police officers would be going out, they'd be seeing, they wouldn't be identifying, hey, she says she's 18, but she really? And just going out. So just changing policing has been a big deal. And, instead of, imagining putting this young woman in juvenile hall, and young men too, right, for being sexually exploited, the John gets to walk home and you get put in custody. It's just kind of a interesting thing. So in Santa Cruz County, we're part of a tri-county protocol that was really kind of recognizing, and you think, wow, how did it take us so long to get here? But hey, we're here now. And we're at least talking about it, and we are no longer saying that these young girls and young boys who are being taken advantage of are actually should be criminally charged. You just think, wow.
They're being exploited in the group homes, John?
Yes, it's actually
I read in the police report.
so frightening. So people
dissolve them all together.
Yeah, so people, they actually had conferences where they talk about, go, you can exploit young children if you go to this group home. It's a great recruiting ground. Yeah, it was horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Juvenile cat houses.
Just so horrible. Yes.
I would like to know, since I'm a resident of Felton and I passed by the probation center there, and how do you determine who goes there and what sort of treatment happens when you get there?
Excellent question. So again, a judge, so if you're arrested and detained in juvenile hall, you have to appear in front of a judge within 40, I'm sorry, I think it's 48 hours of the petition being filed. Excuse me. And so it's a judge determines whether or not you stay there. And then once you are removed from the care, that there's no reasonable means by which this child can be kept safe without removing them from their home, that's a finding that a juvenile judge has to make, then probation is responsible for providing the care that that youth needs. And so you can see how it's incredibly difficult, right? So that's why, so at that point in time, you have to get the medical records. The probation department or the Department of Family and Children's Services is responsible for providing for a case plan for that child. That includes, like, what are their medical needs? What, have they been, so in my Family and Children's Services reports, like, when was their last dentist appointment? When was their last medical appointment? Are they doing counseling? Do they have a diagnosis? All that information is in the social worker reports for both sides. Does that help answer that question? Because you can imagine how, a 17-year-old comes in and they're not very communicative. They talk with the family, and the parents hopefully tell them what they need.
What sort of programs are taking place once they get there?
Well, in that case, if a youth has to remain at juvenile hall, amazing school we have. Again, we have one of the best juvenile halls in the nation. So they take over schooling, they provide all the meals. The meals at juvenile hall are, just very, I haven't eaten there, but I've heard the food's very good. I've done tours and visited the facilities. You're required to inspect the facilities as being the presiding judge of juvenile. And so they have counseling, athletic activities, and so, but notwithstanding that fact that there's all those services there at the jail, at the juvenile hall, I'm sorry, it's still very, very, you're in a locked room, and you have play, there's free time, there's group areas that are really supportive, but it's not home. Did that help answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I have two quick ones.
Okay.
The first one was for you specifically. I wondered at what point in your legal career you knew you might want to be a judge. Mm-hmm. And the second is you've referenced a few times the Continuum of Care
Reform.
Program, and I wondered if you could just briefly summarize for me what that is. It's enacted already or pending?
Yes, it's enacted already. There's a handout. Yes, for MCLE credit, you get MCLE credit if you're an attorney, and this really outlines it was passed in, I believe, 2015, and then because it was such a radical change in terms of making it so there's resource families as opposed to group homes. The department's still trying to come up with satisfying the criteria for this. I think we're doing really well here in Santa Cruz County, but of course we could do better. And then I do think I'm so glad I have 2 hours to talk, because another thing Sarah helped me with is after I had my daughter in 1994, I took some time off. And we all know working mothers, wow, just such a difficult balance. Finding good, my family's down in Southern California, so childcare, I'm incredibly sympathetic. Knowing where your child is, it's just incredibly difficult. And I worked, most of my daughter's life, so I'm one of those parents who I got to stay home with her for 6 months when she was first born, and then I went back to work at the DA's office, and then I only worked at the DA's office for a very short period of time. And so then I opened my own law practice, and after working my own law practice for a while, I really, that I needed a change. I felt like I needed a change. And who was there for me but Sarah Clarenbach? I made an application to work for another judge in San Jose, and I got to work with Magistrate Judge Patricia Trumbull, and she was a good friend of Sarah's. And so I got hired to be a law clerk there again. So I had that experience of working as a law clerk for William Ray, and then I got to be a law clerk for Patricia Trumbull. So I think, after, I didn't know what it was like inside of a courtroom, but I'll have to tell you, after I was down in Los Angeles and part of all the litigation we were doing there, I wanted to be a judge then. I mean, it just, so I had to think, well, how am I gonna get there? What kind of steps am I gonna take? And after it didn't work out, I had a temporary contract at the DA's. After it didn't work out there, I didn't think I'd ever get to be a judge in Santa Cruz County. Again, I thought, okay, that career path has ended. I went and worked for 2.5 years for Magistrate Judge Patricia Trumbull. Wow, she approached the law so differently than Judge Ray. Another amazing mentor. It was so wonderful to get to work with her. She was, pregnant, arguing cases as a federal public defender. She just an incredibly dynamic woman. She's still with us. She's unfortunately suffering from Alzheimer's, very serious. But because I was able to get the technical skills about, it was a electronic filing. We were part of the pilot project in San Jose for electronic filing, and because I had all this expertise in how to practice in federal court, I worked, after working 3 years for her, I worked at the Grunsky Law Firm down in Watsonville, and I worked there for 7 years and became a partner at that law firm, and about 1/3 of my cases were federal cases, and it was great just because I had that expertise about, I knew how to navigate the federal system, write motions. I knew how to practice law in federal court. It really made it so that was a unique niche that I could fill for that law firm. And I really appreciate all the partners I worked with there. But, so that was one of the check marks that I needed to check off my box, right? To make sure that I would be seen as qualified when I was running for judge. As worked for the district attorney's office, worked at, a partner at a law firm, worked for judges. And so, one of the difficult things that women candidates face when they're running for judges is like, you don't have litigation experience. And so I did do civil litigation and did participate in trials, some jury trials, but most of my jury trials were when I was the assistant district attorney, just because that's just one of the criteria that people want to see. Especially on a written application, and I think that's been used, a criteria that's been used to, change certainly here in Santa Cruz County, to make it so, if you look historically, women have not been appointed. And so most of the women have gotten to their position because of election here. Judge Acow, Judge Simons, Judge Colgliotti, and myself. That's a pretty big proportion when you look at my male counterparts. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you explain the difference between foster families and resource families?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is no difference, really. it's now foster, we still use foster care. We still use that word. But essentially now, through the Continuum of Care Reform, instead of a application to become a foster parent, you're applying to become a resource family. So so that's the same. You're now considered a resource family instead of a foster parent. But people, of course, use that same terminology. Does that make sense?
So it's just a change in the terminology rather than a change in the function.
Yes. And well, I think that if you kind of dig deeper in the weeds about the resource family applications, the whole purpose of having these resource family applications is that really they want families who are going to be able to, if a child has some intense emotional or medical needs, that they'll be able to qualify some families for being able to get compensated and paid for that kind of service, whereas in the old system they wouldn't be, right? So there are some nuances that I'm not the best person to answer that question. But now instead of making an application to become a foster parent, you make an application to become a resource parent. Okay. Yes?
About the evening center, and whether that's available 7 days a week, what are the hours, and that program, is it the juvenile probation department? And a second question is, how does a client earn community service credit?
Excellent question. So funding for the evening center, probation I'm sure gets some grants and funds, in addition probably from the Casey Foundation, but I'm not sure. But definitely it is funded by the probation department. And so probably some of the funds that they get to run the probation department are used. And so I don't have that's the most answer that I have for you. I'm not sure how much of it is grant funded versus like solid funding. Does that make sense? But it definitely is funded by probation. Does it offer open 7 days a week? They changed their hours a little. I'm a little out of touch since I haven't been working as a juvenile judge since July. On the weekends, I don't believe it's open. But it may be open on Saturday. I'm not exactly sure, but it is open at least 5 days a week. It's open until I think at least 8 o'clock. And so the kids get dinner there and then they get taken home. So there's pickup, there's rides to and from. Oh. And then there was one other question that I didn't answer.
How does the juvenile earn community service credit?
Right, and so Community Action Board has one of that's a nonprofit in Watsonville, wonderful nonprofit, amazing. If you haven't heard Maria Elena speak, she's like so motivational, she's wonderful. Probation is the group that supervises whether or not you've satisfied your volunteer service hours. So you can do your volunteer service hours through Alianza, and they go pick the students up, and it's part of a weekend work crew, and they do all kinds of interesting types of work, hopefully just, not just like hard labor, right, but that just interesting work for youth. And then if you say we're youth in school and you were on, you could do community service through the SPCA. They'll offer community service through doing all kinds of different things. I, as a judge, would allow sometimes if a youth had some mental health issues, I would just say, hey, let's count their counseling towards their community service hours, because sometimes kids have anxiety disorders. And so being out, I don't want to, if a youth is going to their counseling, I really want to give them some credit and encouragement for doing that. And then working at the Aztecas is community service hours. That qualifies as community service hours. So really, there's almost no limit to what it could be. For community service hours, and probation's very flexible. And then the juvenile judge, Judge Guy, we just want to see youth engaged in pro-social activities. So say they were volunteering and coaching Little League. We would see that as something that would be a pro-social activity that we'd want to give that youth credit for. Yeah. Yes. And then I'll come back to you.
Is there any way that you can bring a gang up before you instead of just an individual person? As you mentioned, that it seems like gangs and drug cartels are, preying on youth and stuff like that. A lot of trouble. But what do you do about it?
Yeah, and you can see, just like the commercially sexually exploited children, you can see young men being very vulnerable to exploitation from older men who, a lot of times you have, wow, is that young man who was left holding the gun, or it's like, oh, that was my gun, right? And you have that with young women too, right? They're all in the car, there's a bunch of adults, and lo and behold, it's the juvenile that claims it's their gun. Right, it's certainly a form of exploitation. And so I just think that we have some wonderful groups. Actually, the only other time I've spoken here, I think, is in the community room where we have the police chiefs meet. And we have the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, and just really working on, again, just trying to find positive pro-social activities that youth can get engaged in, because we know that from a brain development perspective, the young men's brains mature, their ability to be rational, make good decisions, doesn't really kick in until they're 20, around there. It's just there's just really a difference. And so we just need to have positive pro-social activities. And then, we know that there's normal teenage behavior that, the hijinks that we've seen. And unfortunately, just because how law enforcement's done, if you're a young brown man in our community, you may find yourself on probation, where if you were a young Caucasian man smoking marijuana in our community, you wouldn't be, right? Because once you get on probation and you get those drug terms, and you can see how enforcement becomes really different. So the issue about just providing, making sure our schools are safe, making sure there's places for youth to go to have positive interactions where they can go study. And you really feel like I would like to see something like the evening center for the most of the youth who aren't part of our probation center. Right. And so that's why when you go down to Watsonville and you go in there's this great place called the Digital Nest, for example, another nonprofit that's really all about providing young people who don't have access to computers and technology, that they can go there and get those skills. And so it's so involved in education. What is the level of our education? What kind of so our schools are a big part of providing all around, making it so youth can become independent. And so what we find, if a youth isn't engaged in school, right, then they're probably up to no good, essentially. And so really getting youth engaged in school. And so that's another thing a part of the juvenile judges do as well, is you're part of the truancy mediation, keeping kids in school, working with the school districts around what can we do to, you have generations of families who haven't gone to school. And so there's really a connection between going to school and being involved in gangs and having success and criminal outcomes. I mean, and so I was the truancy judge for a long time, trying to encourage parents and families to go to school. Really hard. So I think the schools and the work that we do around the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, those are just really important components to making sure that youth feel like they have opportunities, right? Feel like they have power and empowerment, and feel like if they follow this path to school, they're going to have an opportunity. So, okay. Yes?
Are there good alternative schools available?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's another thing. I was at that fundraiser again last night, and a neighbor of mine works at New School. We have the County Office of Education runs our school alternatives. There's a new school down there, Sequoia. Oh, it's the most beautiful school down in Watsonville. And so there's Freedom Community, there's alternative schools, Loudon Nelson up in the city of Santa Cruz. So just there are, yes, really, our County Office of Education. Ferris Sabah was at the meeting last night, and so yes, very, very active.
Those are utilized.
Very much so. And you don't want people tracked into alternate schools, but sometimes it's really the youth need more support, and we don't want our youth tracked into just independent study either. So that's another, a lot of times people feel like, wait, hold on, if a youth is having problems, then they get in independent study, and then again, they're not where they need to be, like during the daytime. It's just, if they aren't supervised, they're so much more susceptible to exploitation.
Yeah.
It's really so I think we do have a really wonderful alternate school program, and it's exciting seeing schools like Sequoia, and just seeing how really like at Sequoia they have the Sueños program. So it's another program where youth can go and they can help you work on a resume, and things like that to get jobs.
Real practical.
Yes, yeah. Really practical. And at those alternative schools too, I mean, Sequoia, they have this like whole room that's like about a bike workshop, or a whole class that's like, okay, if you're interested in construction, how to actually build buildings, it's just some really amazing alternative programs. So there are some just great alternatives here in Santa Cruz County.
How about foster families? Is it hard to find suitable foster families?
So hard. And so if you are interested or know somebody who would be a resource family, it's incredibly hard. So, and especially finding foster families for teens. And so there's just really, so there is that need. And a lot of times, so that's why it's so important that you engage in these child-family teams, because of course, relative placement is who's willing to take someone in. And sometimes it just takes some really hard work on behalf of the department to communicate how meaningful it could be to have this child in your life, what kind of support you could wrap around this family. And so that's what the hope is with resource families. So wonderful meeting you. Thank you so much for inviting me back. And it's great to see all of you.